Smoke line told by Brittany. People ask me sometimes how I met Brock, expecting some cute story about a coffee shop or a mutual friend's barbecue, and I always have to watch their face change when I tell them the truth. I met him while I was running a wedding party out of a canyon that was about to catch on fire. I should back up. I was 25 that summer, 3 years into working my grandmother's old lookout, Swift Current, a glass box on stilts, 60 feet up, sitting on a ridge in the Flathead National Forest like something out of an old photograph, because it basically was one. My grandmother had been one of the first women hired as a lookout in that district back in the 60s, back when the Forest Service still argued out loud about whether a woman could handle the isolation. My dad grew up half-raised in towers just like it. I used to think I'd end up doing something else entirely. I actually went to college for wildlife biology, but my dad got sick my senior year, and I came home to help out for I thought would be one season. And I came home to help out for what I thought would be one season, and I just never really came back down off the mountain. 6 years later, there I still was, watching smoke instead of songbirds. That particular August, the whole district was on edge. Dry lightning had been stitching itself across the ridgelines for 2 weeks, starting little sleeper fires that would smolder for days before deciding to wake up. I was up in the tower one evening, watching the sky do that thing it does right before dusk, where the smoke turns the color of a bruise, and I saw a new column start climbing out of Coal Creek drainage, thick, fast, standing dead straight up like it had somewhere urgent to be. I've watched a lot of smoke columns in my life. That one didn't look like the others. It looked like it was building something. I called it in. Dispatch told me to stand by, that a research aircraft already had eyes on the same column from above, doing atmospherics work for the incident. I didn't think much of it. Research flights come and go all fire season, mapping smoke plumes, running instruments, mostly staying well out of everyone's way. I had no idea that up in that plane, getting thrown around by turbulence the fire itself was creating, there was a 27-year-old atmospheric scientist named Brock Iverson, watching that same column and doing math in his head that was scaring him. What I found out afterward, because he told me the whole story later, laughing about it in the specific way people laugh about things that terrified them at the time, is that he'd been tracking what's called a pyrocumulonimbus, a fire-generated thunderstorm. The fire had gotten hot enough and the smoke column tall enough that it started making its own weather, building a cloud on top of itself the way an ordinary storm builds off summer heat, except this one was fed by burning forest instead of a warm lake. And those things are unstable. They build fast and then they collapse, and when they collapse, they don't just rain, they punch wine straight down and outward in every direction, like something popped a balloon made of fire. If that happens over a canyon full of people, the fire doesn't creep toward them politely. It gets shoved at them from several directions at once, and there were people in that canyon. A wedding party, of all things. 41 guests camped at a backcountry site near the drainage mouth, there for a wedding that was supposed to happen the next morning, completely oblivious to the column building over their heads. Dispatch came back on the radio and told me the research aircraft was calling for an immediate evacuation of Coal Creek, that I was the closest ground contact, and that I needed to get down there and start moving people right now, not soon. I didn't waste time being surprised. I grabbed my pack, my fire shelter, clipped its radio to my chest, and started half running, half falling down that tower staircase into smoke that stung like it had citrus in it. That's when I first heard his voice. Not in person, over the radio, patched through from the plane, calm in this very specific, practiced way that I'd later learn was just how he talked when things were serious. Like panicking had never once helped anybody, so he'd simply decided not to bother with it. He told me the column's top was starting to shear, which meant it was close to collapsing. He told me not to move people up canyon, because up canyon was a chimney and the fire would use it exactly like one. He told me when I asked him straight out how much time I actually had, not the number Dispatch was guessing, but the number he actually believed, that I had about 8 minutes. I remember thinking 8 minutes, 41 people, half of them probably in wedding shoes. Perfect. So I came into that clearing at a dead run and found exactly the scene you'd expect. A bride in a half-zipped dress frozen mid-sentence, a floral arch, folding chairs, absolutely no framework in their heads, for your ceremony location is about to become a wind tunnel of fire. I didn't waste time being gentle about it. I didn't waste time gentle about it. I told them Forest Service, told them we had 2 minutes, and bring only the chairs and leave the flowers, and bring only people and car keys. The bride tried to argue that she was getting married in 40 minutes. I told her she was getting married somewhere else in 40 minutes. That seemed to do it. We ran. I mean that literally 41 people, including someone's elderly grandmother, getting piggybacked by a groomsman in a half-button dress shirt, and a bride who'd kicked off her shoes somewhere in the first 100 yards, all of us moving down that trail as fast as the ground would let us. And right as we crested the last rise before the trailhead, the wind hit, not a breeze, a wall, hot and smelling like the inside of a chimney, throwing ash sideways in these long orange ropes, and behind it came a sound like a freight train made of static. That was the column collapsing, right on schedule, right where Brock had said it would. We made it, every single one of us. I did a head count out of pure habit standing at the trailhead with ash coming down like a strange localized snowstorm. And when I keyed the radio to tell him, 41 for 41, everybody's out, there was this pause on his end that went on just a little too long, and when he finally answered, his voice had dropped the professional flatness. Just for a second. He sounded relieved in a way that told me he'd actually been scared for us the whole time. Underneath all that calm, I didn't meet him face to face until later that night at the incident command post, one of those fluorescent lit mobile trailers that always smells like burnt coffee no matter what fire you're at, maps taped up on every folding toot, and there he was across the room hunched over a laptop with the incident meteorologist, and when he looked up and saw me, I actually watched him do this to my voice for the first time, like by matching my face, the voice's time, and the two weren't quite lining up yet. Ass. He was taller than I'd pictured, kind of rumpled in that scientist get after being on his plane for 6. With a visible tansom saying where headset had pressed hair down all day, he came over, held out his hand, said something like, Swift Current's current, because apparently my call sign was the only name he had for me. I told him that was a call sign, not a name, and gave him the real one. He apologized for it, feeling strange to shake my hand after spending 3 hours yelling numbers at a voice he couldn't. I told him the numbers had been good. I'd had exactly 7 minutes to spare, which in my line of counts as luxurious. He admitted, a little sheepishly, that he'd rounded down on purpose, figuring I'd move faster if I thought I had less time than I actually did. I called that lying to a woman running a wedding party out of a fire chimney. He said it wasn't lying, it was margin of error, and there was a difference, and I told him I'd made coffee in me before I was willing to concede that point. He said he argued better with caffeine too. It was such a small, dumb exchange, but I remember it clearly, because it was the first time all night I felt like laughing instead of just running on adrenaline. The incident commander pulled me aside to take my account for the record, and told me Command wanted me to keep running Swift Current through the next week, since the fire clearly wasn't done being a problem. Then he turned to Brock and said Command wanted his model data for the post-mortem, since his Pyro CB call had bought us a clean evacuation with 0 injuries, the first clean one of the whole season. Brock said something about being happy to stick around, as long as the atmosphere kept misbehaving. I remember thinking, half amused, that this was a strange kind of guy, genuinely delighted by the same weather, that had just tried to hurt 41 wedding guests. Before I walked off that night, he lingered near the map table a second too long, said something about how crowd control in formal wear wasn't exactly something you train for in fire science. And I told him backcountry rangers train for stranger things than that. I'd had a llama incident back in June I still wasn't fully over. I said it mostly as a joke, a way of ending the conversation lightly, and threw in something like, buy me a coffee sometime and maybe I'll tell you about it. I didn't think much of it in the moment. But I noticed, walking away, that he was still watching me go, in that particular way people have when they're filing something away to come back to later. He came back to it, but came back by then, smoke thinning out over whitefish to something closer to ordinary Montana blue. I was off duty, hair down for once instead of yanked back under a cap, coming out of the hardware store with a bag of stovepipe fittings, and I nearly walked straight into him carrying 2 coffees down Main Street. He said he owed me one. Those had apparently been the terms. I asked what he was still doing in town, since the fire was basically wrapped up in the backcountry by then. He admitted, almost sheepishly, that the official story he'd told his supervisor was that the pyroconvection dataset needed one more week, but that if he was being honest, he'd been finding reasons to stay for a while, and that was starting to look less like scientific diligence and more like a pattern. I liked that about him from early on, how direct he was, in this way that had clearly been trained into him by a job where there's no time to soften bad news about the weather. I told him most people around where I'm from take 4 minutes to say something that should only take 4 words, and I could use more of what he was doing. He said he'd try to keep being annoyingly efficient at me. I told him to do exactly that. We started walking in that loose, unhurried orbit two people fall into when neither one's ready to say out loud that they're not done talking yet. He asked about the llama. I told him that story was earned, not free, and he'd only had one coffee toward it. What followed was a slow stretch of a season, the kind of thing that doesn't sound like much when I list it out, but added up to something. We hiked a burn scar together on one of my days off, and I watched him crouch down and examine fire-scared bark with this genuine, unguarded scientific delight that I found more attractive than I expected to. We sat in diner booths with maps of fire perimeters spread out between plates of pie, while he sketched pyroconvection diagrams on napkins and I corrected his elevation contours from memory, just to give him a hard time. I taught him to read a topo map properly, and caught him getting it wrong on purpose more than once, just to keep me explaining things to him. He drove 2 hours out of his way once, in a borrowed truck, just to bring me actual groceries at the lookout, after I'd mentioned offhand that resupply flights only ever brought canned goods. We spent more than one night on the catwalk outside the tower, cataloging stars instead of smoke for once, shoulders close enough to touch and neither of us quite closing that last little gap. It was on one of those diner nights, actually, mid-September, the first real rain of the season finally coming down outside, the kind that starts pulling containment numbers up instead of down, that I finally told him the llama story, since he'd been asked, patiently and then not so patiently, for weeks. I told him it happened back in June, before the fires had really started, when we got a call about a llama loose up on the High Line near Logan Pass, holding up traffic. Nobody warns you that llama incidents are their own category of ranger work, but they are. We get maybe 2 a summer, mostly pack llamas that slip their lead from outfitters. This one hadn't just wandered off, though. It had decided the parking lot at the Logan Pass Visitor Center was its new territory, and it was spitting at tourists with real commitment. I showed up with a radio and a rope, and exactly 0 llama wrangling training, because strangely enough that's not part of the academy curriculum. Dispatch, in a stroke of genius, patched me through to the one retired guy in 3 counties who'd apparently worked a llama trekking outfit in Peru decades earlier, and he talked me through the whole approach over the radio, dead calm like he was talking someone off a ledge, approach at an angle never straight on, they hate straight on. So there I was, doing this slow diagonal shuffle toward an irritated llama, at one of the most photographed pullouts in the park, while a busload of German tourists filmed the entire thing on their phones. It spat on my jacket twice before I finally got the rope on it, and we walked it 3 miles back down the road to the outfitter, who hadn't even noticed it was missing for 6 hours. 6 hours of unsupervised llama freedom, and it came back looking smug about the whole thing. Brock laughed so hard at that story he had to set his coffee down. It was the best thing he'd heard all year, and he'd flown through an actual supercell back in April. Then he said something that stuck with me, that he thought it might be his favorite thing about me, that the fact that I could hold both halves of the job with the same hands, the wedding rescue and the llama diplomacy, and somehow it didn't unbalance me. I told him most days it didn't. Some days it did, and I just didn't always show that part. He said I didn't have to perform being unbalanced for him to already believe I got that way sometimes. He said already believe my chest properly unclenched. That was the night something in my chest properly unclenched. It's a specific kind of relief, being known without expected to find it with a guy who studied storms for a living. We didn't actually kiss until a couple weeks after that up in the tower once the fire season had really started winding down. He'd hiked up with an actual duffel bag of real food, vegetables, bread, a decent bottle of whiskey, which was frankly a serious violation of at least 4 Forest Service regulation. about overnight guests at a lookout. And he called it bribery. I told him that was evidence, not a defense, and drank it anyway. Somewhere in that conversation, he told me about his dad, a structure firefighter back in Ohio, killed in a building collapse when Brock was 14, and how he'd gotten obsessed with the physics of fire and heat and air pressure afterward, like understanding the mechanics well might make it stop feeling so random. He said it never really worked like that, but he had gotten good at the mechanics I told him about my grandmother, my dad, the 6 years I'd spent up here, instead of doing the wildlife biology thing I'd planned on, and how some days I thought the mountain had picked me the way it picked her, and arguing with that felt like arguing with weather. He said weather doesn't take offense, it's very secure in itself. I laughed, and then he told me, a little sheepishly, that he'd spent 6 weeks finding reasons to stay in a fire zone eating canned beans because he didn't want to stop hearing my voice on a radio, and he didn't quite know what to do with that, except tell me he had it. I skipped every smart, guarded thing I could have said back and just reached over and took his hand. We kissed right there on the floor of the tower, unhurried, certain not some dramatic first spark, but more like the natural conclusion of 6 weeks of radio static and shared coffee, and a wedding party we'd saved together before we'd even properly met in person. It wasn't all easy after that, though. And I want to be honest about that part too, because I think it's the part that actually made it real. When the season closed down in October and I was packing up the tower for winter, he asked what happens to me over the off-season, and I told him trail crew avalanche training back up here come thaw. Then I asked him the same, and he said Missoula was home base through winter, but come spring he goes wherever the fire season sends him. Could be here again, could be Oregon, could be Australia some years. That's a big could be, I told him. He agreed that it was. I told him something then I hadn't planned on telling him yet, about my dad when he was a smoke jumper, gone half the year every year chasing fire across 4 states. My mom used to joke that she'd married a man and gotten a stranger with really good stories twice a year. They made it work, mostly, but I grew up watching what that costs, loving somebody whose whole life runs on a schedule that isn't yours, and I told myself a life around Saunasee's fire season. I told to build a life around somebody else's fire seasons. And here I was, doing exactly that. I told him I wasn't scared he'd lie to me or hurt me on purpose. I trusted him completely on that front. I was scared of the shape of the life itself because I'd watched what it costs the person who stays behind, up close, my whole childhood. He didn't argue with me or try to talk me out of the fear. He just said he wasn't my dad and Missoula wasn't 4 states away, but he'd be lying if he said his job didn't ask a lot of the same things. Then he thanked me for telling him, instead of just quietly deciding something on my own and letting him find out later. That's not really my style, I told him. He said no, it really wasn't, and I could tell he meant it as a compliment. That fear didn't go away over the winter, if I'm honest, but he didn't try to argue me out of it either. Instead, sometime in February over dinner at my place in Columbia Falls, he slid a job posting across the table without much comment. Senior research meteorologist, Kalispell at the Northern Rockies Fire Science Lab, based in Kalispell, 20 minutes from my front door. I asked if he was actually applying for this. He said he already had, and the interview was in 3 weeks. I told him this was a huge step down from field research, that he'd be running models from a desk half the year, instead of chasing storms across the country. He said he'd chased enough storms to know exactly what he wanted to build a life around now. He'd still fly, still do field work, just from somewhere he could come home to instead of somewhere he had to leave from. He told me he'd been thinking about what I said back in October every single week since, and this was his answer, not because I'd asked him to change anything, because I never had, but because he'd looked honestly at the kind of life he actually wanted, and I was standing right in the middle of it, 20 minutes away instead of 4 states. I didn't have a smart, guarded response left for that one. I just crossed the kitchen and kissed him. He got the job. And the following June, when I hiked back up to open Swiftcurrent for the new season, fireweed blooming purple across slopes that had burned black the summer before, he came up the trail behind me carrying his own gear, a badge from the Fire Science Lab clipped to his jacket, telling me with a completely straight face that the new senior research meteorologist got to pick his own field sites for the season opener, and he'd picked here. I told him that was an abuse of federal resources. He said his supervisor had said the same thing and he'd told her it was strategic proximity to critical fire weather data. I asked if that's what we were calling it now. He admitted, a little less smugly, that it was also just true he'd wanted to be there when I opened my tower for the season, and that both things could be real at once. I opened the radio that morning the way I always do. Swift current lookout, opening for the season, all systems checked, fire danger currently low, and added, mostly for him, that the forecast called for a chance of a research meteorologist loitering on site without authorization. Dispatch, who by then had met him plenty of times, told me to try to keep him off the catwalk railing, since insurance hated that. I told her no promises. I should say something about the in-between parts too, because it's easy to skip over the boring stretches when you're telling a story like this, and I think the boring stretches were actually where most of it got built. That first winter, before he'd gotten the Kalispell job, we were doing the long-distance thing without really calling it that. Him in Missoula teaching a grad seminar on convective storm dynamics and grinding through grant paperwork, me picking up trail crew work and avalanche forecasting training through the shoulder season. It wasn't glamorous. Most weekends it just meant his beat-up truck showing up outside my rented house in Columbia Falls, with snow still on the windshield, and us cooking something simple and falling asleep on the couch, before either of us had the energy to do anything more interesting. I used to think before him that if a relationship wasn't constantly exciting, it probably wasn't working. He kind of quietly proved that wrong. Some of my favorite memories from that whole winter are just him at my kitchen table grading undergrad problem sets while I sharpened crampons, neither of us saying much, both of us fine with that. He texted a lot, more than I expected from someone I'd pegged as all business over the radio that first week. Bad puns about snowpack. Photos of avalanche cornices he'd spot on drives out to field site, captioned with something dumb like, "This one's giving main character energy." Little things. I found out later he saved every single one of our early radio exchanges. Apparently there's a way to pull archived incident frequency logs if you know who to ask, and he'd asked, and had printed out our first real conversation, the one about the 8 minutes, and kept it folded up in a desk drawer at his office in Missoula. He showed it to me once, a little embarrassed about it, like it made him seem obsessive. I told him it made him seem like someone who knew exactly what mattered the first time he heard it, and that wasn't the same thing as obsessive at all. There was a rough patch in there too, around Christmas, that I don't love thinking about, but that felt honest to go through. He got offered a short embedded research trip to Australia, 6 weeks, prime fire season down there. Exactly the kind of high-profile field opportunity that would have been great for his career. He didn't hide it from me or make the decision without me, which I gave him a lot of credit for, but he clearly wanted to go, and I clearly didn't want him to, and neither of those feelings were wrong. They were just sitting across the table from each other being difficult. We had a hard conversation about it, not a fight exactly, more like two people carefully laying out the actual shape of what they were afraid of, instead of yelling about the surface of it. I told him I wasn't trying to hold him back from his career. That wasn't the point. The point was I needed to know he was choosing this, choosing us, on purpose and not by default because it happened to be convenient that particular winter. He ended up turning the trip down and told his supervisor honestly why, which I respected more than if he'd just quietly declined without saying anything. He said something to me afterward that I've held on to, that turning it down didn't feel like giving something up. It felt like the first time in his adult life he'd chosen a person over an opportunity and actually meant it, rather than just telling himself he would if it ever came up. I don't want to make it sound like that one conversation fixed everything, because that's not how any of this actually works. But it was the first real test of whether the thing we'd started in a fire tower could survive an ordinary, unglamorous disagreement, the kind that doesn't come with a radio countdown or a wall of smoke to make the stakes obvious. And it did survive it. That mattered more to me, honestly, than the wedding rescue ever did, because anybody can be brave for 8 minutes with adrenaline running the show. It's a lot harder, to be honest, for an entire difficult dinner with nothing but 2 people and their actual feelings on the table. By the time February rolled around and he showed me that job posting, I already half knew what his answer to the Australia question had told me, that this wasn't a guy who was going to string me along through one dramatic gesture and then quietly resume his old life. The second field season opened back up. The job application just made it official. That's the story, more or less. Not a coffee shop, not a mutual friends party, a wedding party running for their lives out of a canyon, a voice on a radio, calling out number submit himself, one small unglamorous of proving to each other that the trust built unglamorous thing at a time, that the trust built under real pressure, holds up just as well once the fire is actually out. People always seem a little disappointed. The story isn't cuter. I always tell them it's better than cute. It's just true.